Is it a webinar? Sorry, I'm having too much fun here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next webinar in the series, and welcome to some of our old friends who are back and to new attendees who are interested in joining us for an hour and trying to answer the question, how the heck do we develop sustainable business models? This has been a major research theme for us for well over 20 years. So we've been trying to help organizations improve their economic, environmental, and social performance, and changing their business models has been part of that. And today we want to make a quick introduction to some of the biggest lessons we've learned from that. There'll be plenty of opportunity afterwards to learn more in detail about different aspects of that, but let's get into the overview. So I'm going to very briefly introduce the idea of what are sustainable business models, why do they matter. Dr. Dorotea Vladimirova will be explaining what the tools are and why they work. So she'll be drawing upon our research that we've understood what works and what doesn't in developing sustainable business models. And Ian Bamford is going to then take us into the practice, how those tools are being used in practice with real life organizations, and draw out some brief examples. Please, please, please submit questions. Some of you have been very kind and have offered some of the hardest questions I've ever read already in your replies by email, but please add to those. We like tough questions. So use the Q&A button at the bottom. We'll collect those questions and we'll have a chance to run through as many as possible at the end of this period together. So let me try and introduce what is quite a big topic. Sustainable business models, what are they and why do they matter? And if you asked the theoreticians, the academics, they would say that sustainable business models and research into them matter because sustainable solutions carry externalities. That is, that the economic system does not internalize, for example, climate change. If you have developed a solution which is better than your competition in terms of pumping CO2 out into the atmosphere, nobody gives you extra money for that. If you are better at something the customer paid for, then it's easy. You don't change your business model because that's internalized. But when we talk to practitioners, actually, they don't mention this problem very often. What they talk about is that the tools and techniques that they are trying to use as designers of business models, as strategists, the tools and techniques are too narrow in their focus on profit and are inappropriate to helping them solve their design puzzle. So we've been doing research answering both of these questions for some time, and we'll draw out today some of those lessons for you. For those of you who've already been in the webinar series, you'll know that we've spent the period until now in the top left-hand corner of the 4 boxes of research that we do at the Center for Industrial Sustainability here at the IFM. Today, we're going to start into the value box for the first time. So welcome to Value Innovation, everyone. When did the first 94 mile per gallon car become available to the British public? Well, I'm going to tell you, and you can look it up. It's the Audi A2 3L. 3L stands for 3 liters per 100 kilometers or 94 miles per gallon. It was in 2003. Why aren't they available now? Why can't I go to the shops and buy these lovely pieces of technology? And what I'm trying to suggest to you is that we already have technology that delivers amazing performance. But the business model does not work. The company that sells you this 94 mile per gallon car does not maximize their profit, even though the total cost, you as a customer buy a lot less fuel, the total cost is less for all concerned. This is a business model failure, and why we understand why we study this subject and why it's important. Take something slightly different. For those of you who are fast fashionistas, you typically pay about £50 per week to buy clothing, and your modal use is one. You wear the marquee item once. If your wardrobe is as tidy as the one on the left, it'll be a surprise. The average fast fashionista has about £3,500 of credit card debt. So clearly, this is a situation that we'd like to change. And if we went to government ministers and asked them what to do about it, they'd probably recommend some form of re-education of British consumers or some form of frontal lobotomy. I would like us to be far more creative than that. What if those people had access, by paying £25 a week, they had access to a card that allowed them to have 20 items at home in their wardrobe, but they could take those items back to the shop on any day of the week and swap them for a new item. That allows them to behave like a fast fashionista. But what it also allows them to do is to spend less money. It's cheaper for the customer to buy this service. Interestingly, it's 3 times the profit level, 200% more profit to sell this service than to sell the original garments. And one of the reasons is that each fiber keeps coming back and making more money. And because of that, we can assess the environmental impacts. And we know that in this model, you also have half of the greenhouse gases and half of the land use devoted to cotton production, for example. So these are fantastic benefits, only available if we change our business model. And that's why it's so important that we help companies improve their business models. And our research over the last 25 years has developed a suite of tools. We're not going to go through them in detail today. We can in future webinars. This suite of tools I'm showing here help organizations ask very basic questions, starting at the left-hand side, going all the way through to practical implementation of business plans on the right-hand side. So if we have a set of tools, where does the logic come from that helped us create those set of tools? And now I'd like to hand you over to Dorothea, who's going to explain that logic and where it comes from.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see many familiar names. So what I'm going to share today is really a snippet of what we know about sustainable business models. And like Steve said, it's been years in the making, and the effort of maybe a dozen researchers, including several PhDs, to bring us to the point where we can share with you a couple of slides very confidently. And let's see how to make this work. I'll start with our starting point of our research, and also by calibrating our understanding of what business model is. We've all come with our conception or a preconception of an idea of what a business model is, either from the business world or from your research, where many of you are coming from. So we started with trying to understand the mainstream thinking around business models. And what we found as a common definition and understanding is that a business model is the logic of how a company creates, delivers, and captures value. And at the core of the business model sits the value proposition. So being the researchers and always asking questions people, we wanted to understand what lies beneath. So we went out to understand value better in order to understand how to create better business models. And since we're interested in sustainability and how to create sustainable business models, The goal was to start by understanding sustainable values so that when we bring that underlying logic into the business model thinking, then we can start talking about sustainable business models. And what we refer to as sustainable value are the three forms of value, as in economic, environmental, and social value, that can emerge in different ways, in different forms. The most obvious being economic value, which refers to its monetary forms through growth of companies' profits, returns on investment, all those familiar things. Where things became more interesting is when we started thinking about forms of environmental and social value. So what is environmental value? And a lot of that was about efficiency, so doing more with less. But as we went through the research, we wanted to go all the way through actually creating positive impact. So forms of value that are not only trying to do less bad, but actually actively, proactively creating positive environmental value. And social value, which has been traditionally talked about as in job creation and health and safety, could really extend beyond that and look into community development and well-being and introducing higher standards for businesses and for society in general. So building on that understanding of what sustainable value is, and then studying many companies that are doing sustainable business models in different ways, some better than others, some more focusing on environmental values, some focusing on social value, many being able to integrate economic, social, and environmental value in a successful business model. We've observed several strategic shifts that really helped put sustainability at the core of the logic of value creation, delivery, and capture. So what are these shifts? Starting with rethinking what the purpose of the business is. So shifting the thinking from business is for making money to actually thinking of purpose beyond profit, and reevaluating the idea around profit that being the engine that realizes the purpose of the business. So really injecting meaning into the business is what we observed with these companies. And like I already alluded to, is adopting a broader meaning of value. So extending the notion of value beyond economic to incorporate environmental and social value at the same time within the same umbrella of the business model is what we really want businesses to pursue, which leads to the next shift, which is shifting from the primacy of the shareholder to actually including a wider group of stakeholders into the business model consideration is critical to creating a sustainable business model. Expanding the range of stakeholders all the way to include natural environment and society as primary stakeholders of the firm, giving them the same level of importance as other primary stakeholders like customers and shareholders. So having proxies or representatives or voices that speak for nature and society is a very fundamental shift and difficult to make, but we've seen it done by companies, and it's really changed how they see, how they do, and how they explain things about their business. So we already mentioned internalizing externalities, but how do you actually do that is what is interesting for us. And it's through the design of product service systems, as we call it, but it's really the combination of either a product or a service or an integrated product service offering that enables taking on more responsibility by the business. So really expanding the boundaries of responsibility beyond the organization and beyond the firm to become responsible for variables, for issues, for challenges that are outside the business. And all of these shifts inevitably lead to adopting a more longer term and systems view of the business, because you are naturally expanding the system boundaries of the business and the boundaries that your business has been traditionally operating. So part of our solution is, like I already said, expanding the group of stakeholders. So considering multiple stakeholders as part of the business model design and conversation, starting with the obvious one, but also adding on voices for employees and society and the environment, and inviting those voices into the conversation and the actual process of business model design is quite important. Bringing in the multiple forms of value, or as many of you are familiar, the triple bottom line, in a way that it helps you uncover new value opportunities, is what we've also been very much interested. And by doing all of that, like I said, you are building that capability to have a systems view of your business and think beyond the immediacy. This doesn't mean you ignore the immediate operations, but you're building up that capability to think longer term, to bring new ideas and new ways of doing business. And in terms of going about thinking these new forms of value, and how do you find these new value opportunities, and how do you create these new clever ideas? What we came up with over many years of research and multiple researchers' efforts, including several PhDs, is this structured approach to thinking about value and to actually inquiring about value in this wider stakeholder network that we want to be part of the business model design and conversation. So if we remember, we said business model is about value creation, delivery, and capture. So if we start from the captured value, or what we're already benefiting from and doing well, that gives us the status quo and gives us an understanding and positioning of our business model. But if we want to bring in these new ideas around sustainability and the voices of nature and society and multiple forms of value, how do we find those opportunities to have these conversations? And what would these conversations lead to is the discovery of new forms of value. How do we look for those? Is by asking simple questions that will help us uncover hidden value, or what we call in our research value uncaptured. So this hidden value is where we want to be able to create new value opportunities from. How do we go about actually doing this in practice? Is by asking several simple questions of this wider group of stakeholders that now are thinking in terms of multiple forms of value. We ask several different questions. The first is around, what does the business give but doesn't get a return from its network? And that will often give us ideas around what value is missed in the business. The next question is about, what does the business give that the stakeholders don't want? And that will give us a lot of answers around what value might the business be destroying for the network. In terms of what does the business give or has too much of, will reveal forms of value that allude to some form of redundancy or surplus or excessive capacity that is probably not well looked after and that we can utilize. And the last one is, what does the stakeholder group of network want, but they don't receive from the company? Is a form of value absence, or a lot of you may recognize this as a gap or unmet needs that stakeholders have. So really turning the ideas into questions and then asking these questions proactively is how you get to change how companies see, how companies explain, and how companies do business. And this is what we found to companies that have actually done that in practice, and some examples will come right now from Ian.
Ian Bamford. I have a very fortunate role in the centre, and that is that I get to take and play with the research outputs from our various teams and take them and work with them in businesses and in the real world, and then try and embed them more long term. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples of where we've used the sustainable business models in different places. If I could see the first slide, that'd be great. So first area I want to talk about is business models and how we use them in helping a major company thinking about their transition from the oil and gas to renewables sector. So this was a major supplier of engineering services, one of the world's leaders, and the challenge they had was, or still have, but they're on process now, is how to transition their services in order to cope with what they perceived to be the inevitable decline of the oil and gas business. And they were looking to find a way of understanding that and understanding what the implications were for their business models and the way in which they create value. So we work with them using all of the 8 tools that Steve briefly showed you earlier, and I'll come back to later, in order to come up and develop that within a test area, and to have a long-term plan over 2 business cycles they were thinking in order to be able to make that transition. I can see the next slide gives us an indication of what some of the outcomes were. So we worked with them over a course of just over a year, and we're able to build them a detailed plan that allowed the process of transitioning their business towards a model that would be suitable for the renewable sector, but particularly where it operates in harsh environments, because harsh environments are where they were able to, with us, identify that they had particularly unique ways of creating value, not only for customers, but also for societies operating in those areas or living in those areas, and able to take into account environmental impact and the environmental results of the way in which they operated. They built a detailed understanding of how they could exchange value in that sector, and where and with whom they would need to work. So they were able to build up a map of what their business would look like in this new way of working, what sort of customers, what sort of partners they would need in order to be able to deliver and the value that was going to be needed in the renewables area. That way they could be sure that they were transforming the way their business worked, in other words, the capabilities that they would need, the areas and parts of the world in which they would operate, the environmental regulations or other regulations they would need to understand and be able to both operate within, but potentially also have some influence over the time frame of the change. As a result, they have now got and are running a major pilot in one of their global regions where they are putting these things into place, and they're putting them into place in interesting ways. So as well as identifying that they would need new skills and capabilities that didn't exist in the areas that they would want them to be, so they started to work with universities and schools in order to ensure that the skills and knowledge and capabilities that they would need in their resource pool in the future would be available in the areas that they needed it to be. So they started to build sustainable value in communities through education as part of this, just to give an example of the sort of things they were doing outside of the areas that you might expect that would be more standard from a commercial only view of the world. And one of the bonuses they got from all of this was, while they were going through this program, they identified a very interesting opportunity to vertically integrate some of their business by understanding how some of their current value exchanges were failing and where there was an opportunity to correct them. And they've estimated the value of that new opportunity to be over £3.5 billion pounds. I think it might have been dollars actually, but so interesting, an interesting outcome in an engineering sector. Let's look at another example. So the next slide looks at an example from the chemical sector, and this is a different example, not only a different sector, but here we worked with two different companies at the same time. So here there was a multinational chemical company, and they were engaged in a program to bring some breakthrough technology that a startup that they had identified and were wanting to work with had developed. They both came to us together to say, could we work with them, because they'd like to create business models that would be beneficial in both companies. So they wanted a business model that would enable the technology that was being adopted to be most effectively utilized within the chemical company, but they wanted to help the startup also maximize the benefits of their business model, because they recognized that if they wanted to have a long-term relationship with that company, the company itself would also need to have a sustainable future. We ran this, again, the whole tool set over a course of about 1.5 years with these two companies. And we worked particularly with their head of innovation, their innovation department, technical specialists from across the business, as well as the commercial side of the multinational. And we worked with the leadership team of the startup, sometimes working with them collectively. So we had some events and workshops where both groups were in the room and sharing information, and sometimes privately, so that we could work with them to understand where they might have areas of commercial sensitivity they didn't want to share with the other organization at that stage. And the sort of outcomes that we got from that were again, very positive, as you'll see in a second. In particular, some of the benefits were that the multinational company was able to bring the chemical benefits that they would get from this breakthrough technology. They worked out so they could do it and get it to market 3 times faster than they planned. So by thinking differently about how they would utilize the relationship with the other company, they were able to get a substantial market advantage. They were able to expand the value proposition that they were making on the back of this technology to include things like an energy reduction of 50%. So the substantial environmental benefit, which they hadn't thought about or hadn't understood previously, and were able to work out how to build that into their future value proposition for customers, as well as for regulators. They also benefited hugely in reducing the footprint of their manufacturing operations. And that gave them significant advantage in terms of thinking about how their business would develop in the future, not only in existing, but also new locations. And the implications that that has as well for the environment and societal impact that they have in the places that they operate. We worked out that they could test and add new compounds during the rollout, rather than having to roll out using one compound and then start to bring new ones on board. So as well as getting to market 3 times faster, they were able to bring new things into the mix significantly faster too. And all of this gave them the ability to expand into markets faster, and with the ability to control the IP of the compounds they were providing, because they could take this technology into their business more easily. the startup got some really interesting benefits as well. They identified a different form of contracting with the multinational that gave both of them quite a lot of additional value benefit. So that extended their supply contract considerably with the multinational, giving them some long-term financial security. It also allowed them to open up a demonstration facility and use the multinational as a credible case for that. So their demonstration facility was in the compound of one of the multinationals' operating areas. So they got a lot of benefit from that. And therefore they were also able to add in to their value proposition for prospects some of the specific benefits that were identified, such as the energy reduction or the footprint reduction, or into their value proposition for other future prospects. So that's a different form of example. If we move on to a third, so a third very different area again, looking at textile waste to landfill. So we worked with a large clothing retailer who had a goal of significantly reducing their textile waste to landfill. And at the same time, they recognized that they needed to improve the entrepreneurial skills, which they called intrapreneurial, in thinking about how could they make the people within their organization more outward thinking, more agile, more capable of identifying opportunities and working out how to bring them through the structure and the complications of the large organization and get them to market and get the benefits from them. They wanted ideally to lift the percentage of clothing avoiding landfill to over 50%. That was a very ambitious goal that they set themselves. We worked with them over a 2-year period. We used some of the tools we've seen here several times over the course of that engagement in order to help them identify what they might do themselves, but also understand some of the disruptive business models that they could bring into their business. If we look at the outcomes for that, they identified a number of different things that they could do that they didn't understand they had the capabilities for up until that point. They were able to put forward 3 specific costed and developed opportunities to their board. One of them, was very significant, in the region of 3 billion per annum of new revenue. But all of them had at the heart of what they did the ability to drive their control and reduction of textile waste through not only what they were doing at beginning and middle of life, but also by thinking about how they could get involved with and influence what happened at end of life with this. They also got to understand what other disruptions might be coming down or coming into their markets and how they might respond to those. So part of the overall use of these tools and thinking about where and how value could be created or was being missed at the moment allowed them to think, oh, okay, there are people are there perhaps looking to exploit that and find their future, some of their future competitors. This one of the outcomes of this, which I was going to put on here, is the one that Steve identified at the very beginning. The ability to think very differently about how you manage your relationship with clothes, and certainly in the fast fashion area, what that might mean. So hopefully I've given you 3 very different examples of the sorts of ways this engages. The slide next up will give you, what we've learned as a result of that. So we've worked with over 350 companies now using all or some of these tools. That's a lot of businesses, and we've learned that actually they work across the board. We use these to help startups think about what and how they can make sure that sustainability is embedded in their business models from the outset. And we work across the board with all sizes of businesses to help them think about how business models they have now could be adapted, or how new ones developed. It seems to work across all the sectors we've engaged in, and we've engaged in nearly all of them now. It works when you're bringing new products to market, or looking at bringing new technologies into business, or when you're practically or specifically looking at business models for their own benefit. All of those are very powerful ways of innovating within businesses and ensuring that you maximize the benefit, not only for the business, but also for society and the environment as well. One of the key things we have identified is that people find this value in plain sight. We don't turn up with some marvelous Cambridge insight into every business and every way of operating that allows us to point out the things that people haven't been able to see. What we're able to do is allow people to understand where the things that they're doing are already failing to create value or destroying value, or where there is value that they could be providing but they're not. So it's a way of helping understand and explore that. And we run this with sometimes just one tool and sometimes with 2 or 3 or the whole lot. So it works in many ways. So the next slide is another brief, I think. Yes, so here are the 8 tools. In order to make sure we have plenty of time for answers and questions, I will just say they're interesting. If you'd like to understand more about them and how they fit together and how they work separately, then do come and talk to us about that. The final slide I think I have is, so how can you get started? Well, there are 2 ways really. You can read Dorothea's PhD, and everything you'll need to know is encapsulated there in less than 7 volumes. And you could and can start from that point. Alternatively, there are other ways into this area, and we run training and overview courses to help people understand the tools in detail, where you get to have hands-on experience of using them and seeing them in test cases. If you wanted to, you could contact me and I can talk you through how and what they might do for you or your business. And later in the summer, when we launch the Sustainability Club, there will be a part of that club that will focus on business model and value creation. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Steve Evans back. I hope we've managed the transition smoothly. The timing is absolutely perfect. We've got lots of times to try and answer your questions. Normally, if my screen wasn't being used, I would be busy scrolling through the questions and pulling some out and challenging the audience. So I'm going to have to do that, and it's going to have to be visible in front of you potentially. Let me start by throwing out to the panel some of the questions that were sent in prior to the start of the webinar. And one of the first and toughest questions was, does environmental sustainability pay? I wonder if somebody can help us with that one.
So I think environmental sustainability definitely pays. Obviously, you can find examples and make choices about environmental sustainability that don't pay. In the same way that you can make choices in all parts of your business to do things that don't pay and are destructive. But increasingly, what we've spotted, spotted is the wrong word, what we've become encouraged by is that's recognized. And just to give you an example, when we started, when I started down this route 10 years ago, we would often get this question, well, it would be nice to do things that would be more sustainable and environmental, but I never persuade the board or my manager that they've got that money to invest in something that won't give them a return. And a few, maybe three or 4 years ago now, I I was invited to a session with food manufacturers to explore with them, what are you doing and why aren't you more sustainable? And as we introduced them at the beginning of the session and asked them those questions, they said, well, no, of course we do. You know, we recognize that, that you know, being efficient and operating to reduce waste and within our businesses is absolutely makes sense. It's part of the way in which we structure and plan and build our year-to-year operational model. So, you know, don't go down that route. We're not fools, you know. So I think, you know, from my perspective, it is, and the evidence is there by the number of people that are seeing how they build it into their businesses now.
So I'm going to offer the next level of challenge in the same direction. The second question from the previously delivered questions: how do you argue with a board who are very much focused on short-term quarterly profits and delivery to shareholder value? Yeah, we all recognize that question, but I think Ian is pointing out that when you look at some of your competition and others around you who've changed the way they look at this, and I would encourage you to think, if your organization believes that sustainability is going to be expensive, I can guarantee that it will be, because that's the mental model you bring to finding solutions. You will go and put your hands in your pockets and find expensive solutions. If, on the other hand, you're a terrible meanie and somebody says, how are we going to become environmentally sustainable or socially sustainable without spending lots of money? You have to use your brains rather than your wallets. And those companies who've used their brains rather than their wallets have learned more. As well as spending less, they've learned more. And they're the ones that we tend to work with. So if your organization is stuck in a paradigm of spending money to solve these sorts of problems, I would suggest stop spending money and find another pathway. And in that case, you have the possibility of winning that argument. Now I'm going to have a look at some of the other questions in here. There was a really good question early on about how do we bring environmental stakeholders and views into this process. And I know Dorothea slightly hinted at it in her presentation, but if you can pick that up, how do we bring them in? Because the planet does not speak for itself.
Yes, and it's a very, very good question. It starts with, like Steve said, it starts with a shift in the mindset. So how do we think of environment now? We think of the environment as being a resource. We think of it as being a natural capital. So this is something that can be used and depleted, and in some cases replenished, but mostly, you know, used and utilized. So shifting the mindset from nature and environment being a resource to being a stakeholder and an active stakeholder in the value creation system that we're in is where you start. And after you do that and you adopt this new mindset, you then look around first within your company, and you can identify the people within the company that have that mindset already, even though it's not explicit in their job description or in the role that they are performing. And first invite those people, and they could be there, your sustainability manager, they could be someone else who has these beliefs, but you can start within your company. If that's hard to identify, which is actually, we see that a lot of companies identify people within the organization to speak for the environment, you look outside and you look at maybe an NGO or a charity or an advisor or a journalist that can bring that voice into the conversation. But it's really shifting the mindset and then finding a person that can play that role of being the voice and personifying the environment. And that changes the dynamic in these conversations, and how you look at the business model and how you exchange value with the environment when you have someone on the other side is really powerful.
Thank you, Dorothea. I just wonder, sorry, I've hidden your face, Ian, whether you wanted to add into that. I would comment that we find, and Ian made this point, that people are actually incredibly knowledgeable about their current business models and the ecosystem that they're part of. So the first order answer to the question, effectively, if you accept that the planet is a stakeholder, and we suggest you do because it's insightful, actually you can speak on behalf of the planet as a first order answer. You can say, well, we know that our products are doing these things, that our actions are doing these things. Those are not great things, but we also know that we could do great things for the planet. So that's the first order. The second is typically you commission research. So you can do desk research about what people have written about your sector and the positive and the negative interactions with the environment. We've seen people do focus groups, you know, from small, very tight ones to having 100 people in the room where you bring those stakeholders in. And the final version is actually bringing the planet into your governance system. So you might have a non-executive director with direct responsibility in this space, and you go to them for information. So there's a number of ways of doing it. I want to move on to some of the other hard questions. One person has asked a question about dynamic business models, and I wanted to use that to make a very particular point. One of the things that we find is if we go back 4 or 5 years, many organizations were coming to us and they were doing design exercises. And it was really fun. You know, we do workshops, we design really interesting business models, and then nothing would happen, right? They go, oh, thank you. We've learned a lot, and we've designed a really fantastic business model that's better than our current business model. But of course, we didn't really mean it. We're not going to change our business, are we? We just had a bit of fun and a bit of learning. A, that's not happening now. People are being really serious. And B, we studied that problem and tried to understand why is it people were getting to the build phase, but not necessarily to the implement phase. And you can understand why, because for a new business model to work successfully, it may need to scale completely. So it may need to take over the entirety of your business before it actually becomes profitable, because you've got to give it time to get learning curve benefits and scale benefits. When you run that business model as an experiment, let's say you do it only in Sri Lanka, then you may not make profit because you don't yet have scale and learning benefits. What we're finding is that people are running hybrids, so they're picking a region, they're picking part of their set of products, they're picking a particular subset of customers, running the new business models in that store, in that region, but very quickly assessing not was it profitable today, but will it be profitable in the future, and then expanding. So I think that world has changed. We are seeing people learning how to be quite good at experimenting with their business models. And I think 5 years ago, they really weren't very good at that. I've got a very particular question on transporting waste. Can I ask you to put that in the really bloody difficult box? Because I'm assuming you're a UK company and you're referring to the fact that you need a waste transfer license and you need to be accredited as a waste handling operator to be able to move waste from your company to another company. There are a few get outs on this. Please email and we'll try and help you with that one. Now, I don't know if anybody else has been looking through the questions and has found any of interest. Please put your hands up. Go on.
So there's a question in here about circular economy and whether this is appropriate or suitable for a circular economy, and whether you need to do anything differently. It's a nice simple question to answer, because yes, the tools work fine when you're thinking about circularity and how you might need to adapt your business model if you're looking to find ways of closing loops with part of your business. And we actually have one of the tools specifically designed to look at how value is created and how value is missed or not, is uncaptured across the life cycle. And by looking at it in that way, it's possible to build circular and closed loop ways of making changes there. So that's a short question and a shortish answer.
Can I be incredibly rude and steal time? I need to answer Dr. Bloody McCardle's question. Hello, Liz. Haven't talked to you for ages. Good to hear from you. And she's asked, how much are SME manufacturers getting involved? You know, are they effectively, if you're part of a very tight supply chain, how do you change your business model when you're in the middle of a supply chain where you've got very big people supplying you with raw materials, you know, Tata Steel, and you've got very big companies, Rolls-Royce, taking your products? You're the little one in the sandwich, right? And it's quite hard to change. For those SMEs in manufacturing, it has been a bit of a struggle. But if you go back to Ian's example, even though he's talking about billions, one company that's in the middle and squeezed in the oil industry was finding really interesting new business models. And they could not get their customers to change their way of interacting with them. But they found a way of looking for a business model on the side. So the other answer to your question, Liz, is that for much of our work, we are working with SMEs because they're actually more innovative. They're more willing to take a risk at the side of their business and find really exciting future opportunities, because they're looking in the long term, not just to survive for the next 3 months, although of course that's a big challenge. Does anybody else want to take up any of the questions?
I'll take the one from Justina that says, what are the best strategies for getting stakeholders and management buy-in into widening their perception of value? It's a very good question. The best strategies is to start the conversation. First, to prepare for such a conversation by actually finding some of the forms of value that I was referring to. So identifying the forms of environmental and social value that's already occurring in the business, and then inviting the stakeholders that are affected positively or negatively is how you start that conversation. So really starting to shifting their mindset around the value exchange that is occurring between the business and the stakeholders. It does need some preparatory work where you actually go and do this inquiry of where is the hidden value and in what forms the hidden value comes in, and then engaging and inviting the stakeholders to a conversation, a structured conversation, ideally. We do these structured conversations with some of the tools where we just facilitate the conversation in a way that is neutral and is not confrontational in terms of you're doing things wrong. It's actually having a conversation and understanding, and that's where it starts from. In some way, in other cases, it might start from a real problem, that you have a massive failure of some sorts, and you see that if you don't fix that failure, you will lose a lot of value in many, not just monetary, but maybe you will lose customers or their trust or their perception of how the company does business. So there's different ways of going into this conversation. One could be, I really want to start this conversation, and we have a process of doing that. Another one could be where we have something that's going really wrong, and that could be a starting point of bringing in the ideas around different forms of value.
So I've found two questions. We're nearing the end. I found two questions that are helpful in allowing us to make a much bigger positional point about the research that we've been doing, the understanding that we built and what it might mean. So the first question is from Stefan, who asks, do we have some sustainable business model templates, e.g. a template that might work for the chemical company and a different template that might work for discrete manufacturers? Chemical companies are a challenge because they've got massive prior investment, often hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment that are fixed, and they're trying to sweat those assets. So yes, they tend to have a very particular set of behaviors. But if we go far enough back, we'll find that the chemical management business model is actually one of the older sustainable business models that is out there. And I'm going to suggest that was largely forced upon them by the car companies who wanted not to have to manage their own chemistry. And in the early days of sustainable business model research, a lot of sustainable business model innovation was kicked off by a customer demanding things. You may have heard of the very famous Rolls-Royce Power by the Hour business model. That was kicked off from a complaint from Singapore Airlines. It was not an originated idea inside Rolls-Royce. So these days, we're finding companies are wanting to control that narrative for themselves and control their own futures. So that's happening much less and less. The second point to my answer is, if you look far enough back in our research, we were very busy trying to find sustainable business model archetypes. We were trying to find out what are the variables. If your company looks like this, if you have these sorts of environmental problems and challenges, then click, 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 you should use sustainable business model type number 4. And we would pull type number 4 off the shelf. We studied that problem for over 15 years before we realized it doesn't work. I am afraid my most cited paper is wrong because people love archetypes, and that's why they cite those papers so often. But it's wrong, it doesn't work. And what you've seen today is a set of tools which ask a series of questions in a standardized way. And what we've found is if you ask really smart questions, people can design their own business models. That's not what we used to think 10 years ago. And I think that's incredibly important comment for today. And as if the questions can't get any bigger, I've got a question from Anastasios Vasilopoulos, and I'm really sorry if I've said that wrong, which asks, what are our thoughts on the concept of degrowth versus growth? I'm going to say that, and I'm going to place it in coronavirus, we're not going to go back to the old system. We're not going to recover to something that looks similar to the system that we were operating in October 2019, I'm afraid. And I think this is potentially really important to understand that a 70-year stable period of regular growth is probably behind us. But that doesn't mean that we go backwards in terms of delivering value. And in fact, business models are essential to this. If we can deliver fast fashion for half the price, for double the profit, that is degrowth. Everybody's spending less money, but they're getting more value and halving the environmental impact. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not scared of degrowth. It isn't about consuming less, it's about consuming better and having business models that are more aligned with well-being and health in a way that I'm very happy to give you my money because you're making me feel happy, but I may not be giving you as much money as before. You're generating more profit. If we can improve profit, reduce environmental impact, improve the health and well-being of our staff and our customers, what's not to like about all of that? So I think what we've been talking about today is a really good example of why the future is going to be different. And I think we're going to slowly wean ourselves away from a language that emphasizes growth as if it's the only objective that exists out there.